Hello, I'm Dr. Roush. I'm the instructor for Modern China, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about the course, give you some information, make sure it's the right course for you, and to just kind of open things up if you have any questions. So, first of all, uh, Modern China, I think, has a fascinating history. I love studying the history of China. There's just so much going on. It's in many ways an extraordinarily remarkable country. It's very, very old. It's managed to have a unified state that's governed a huge portion of the world population, a huge amount of manufacturing going on. Lots of interesting ideas have come out of China. It's almost a whole world in and of itself. So I love studying Chinese history. And that history, of course, is increasingly relevant. So I was born in 1978, and our major focus when I grew up was the Soviet Union, an entity that no longer exists, which I think is really striking. And China was just kind of off to the side. I mean, we knew it was big, um, and it was important, but not that important in many ways, right? It's just not something that came up that much. But increasingly, um, you hear, if you listen to news or watch news, you're going to see something about China. There's a sense that what happens in China, or what China does outside of China, significantly impacts the United States and the rest of the world. So in many ways, it's becoming increasingly relevant. And that's something that, historically speaking, at least from the American perspective, is something that's developed in only the last 2 or 3 decades. So that's really striking in many respects. At the same time, it's often deeply understood. So in the 1980s in particular, there was this sense that China was just going to become just like the United States or the European democracies. And it's interesting because as I'm preparing this class, um, I'm reading some books, and it's interesting to read something, say, that was written in 2000 and see that there's this kind of idea that, yes, China's on the trajectory that's going to make it into a democracy. And for many people, it was more or less, the question was, how quickly will that happen? Not will it happen, or will it even be possible to happen? And I think that's because of some very deep misunderstandings of Chinese politics and society. And I want to stress, I'm not looking down saying, aha, these people misunderstood. I often have misunderstood China, and I probably still have misunderstandings, but I'm doing my best to learn as much as possible as I work on this class. Now, my own research background, I'm a specialist in Korea. When I write research articles and things like that, I write them on Korea. But I bring that up just to emphasize how big and important China is, because if you want to study Korean history, you usually have to learn Chinese too, how to read Old Chinese. I can't speak Chinese. If you give me something in modern Chinese, I'm going to struggle with it. I can read Old Chinese as long as it's printed. I can't read cursive, and I'll need a dictionary a lot of the time, but I can read it. Um, and it's interesting because Korean documents until the early 20th century were mostly in Chinese. And even into the 1960s, especially in South Korea, they still contained a lot of Chinese. And if you want to develop your vocabulary in Korean, you have to study Chinese characters. So that just shows just how important it is. Now, one thing, hopefully that's been enough to kind of get you excited for the course. I know I'm excited. One thing I do want to stress so that you understand, people sometimes use the word modern to mean the same thing as contemporary, and that's not quite correct or accurate from a historical point of view. When we talk about modern, we're talking about a particular period of history that can vary by country, but we start this course in the 16th century, which is usually considered early modern. Right. So now the focus is going to be on more recent history, but I do want you to understand when you come that first day of class and I start talking, or you're listening to the first video lectures, I'm talking about like Ming Dynasty China and its founding in the 14th century and how it's having all these problems in the 16th century. You'll be like, wait a second, am I in the right class? You're in the right class. Historians, we understand modern in a different way than it's often used. Oftentimes, like I said, people use modern just to mean contemporary. So just to tell you a little bit about structure of this class, this is a hybrid class, right? So what will happen is basically before class, there will be a series of video lectures similar to what I'm doing here with accompanying study guides. And there will also be readings that you'll do. Sometimes these will be kind of articles, but you're usually going to be primary sources, either historical documents. Sometimes there'll be things like Chinese literature. Like I'm a big fan of Lu Xun, who wrote a bunch of really amazing short stories in the early 20th century. Some of them will be Chinese comics. So, for example, there will be excerpts of a comic that was written in the 1950s by the Communist Party announcing a new marriage law that would allow women to initiate divorce. And they created this comic to educate women and others about that law. So those are the things kind of you'll read, you'll complete an assignment, turn that in, and then we'll meet in person, right? And in person, when we actually meet, that's when we'll focus on review, the material, make sure you got it. Then we'll look at, we'll discuss that material, and we'll usually have some kind of activity to help us to better understand the material and to build on it. So both these portions are important, right? You need to do the online part. You also need to come to class in person. This is not an online only class. It is a hybrid class. So that means doing things outside of class. And usually those are things like listening to lectures, right? We don't need to be together to hear a lecture. You can just do that on your own, do the assignment. But then when we meet, it's going to be more focused on non-lecture activities, right? Review and discussion, that kind of thing. So hopefully that will be of interest to you. And then we would have a quiz based on what you did in the video portion and what we did when you met, and that will be taken outside of class though. And of course, then there will also be exams, but that's basically what your grade is going to be based off of. Assignments, quizzes, exams, attendance at discussion. Now, one thing I want to note, this course is cross-listed. So there is a regular history section, History 372, and then there's an honors section. The lectures are the same, but the discussions will be a bit different, right? So one thing, basically what I do is I meet with the regular history class on Tuesday, and on Thursday I meet with the honors class. You need to attend where you're registered for, of course, because they are different classes. They share the lectures. However, what happens is over time the discussions will become a little bit different. The activities might be a bit different depending on student interest, right? There's so many different things to talk about. A lot of times I can tailor the class according to what students are interested in, right? So that is something that will kind of develop as the class goes on. Now, I do want to note this is a difficult class. It's not easy to learn Chinese history. There's a lot of history that you may not be familiar with. If you are not familiar with Chinese names, they can be a little bit tricky. There's lots of X's and Z's in Chinese names, for example. And when it's difficult to pronounce a name, it's difficult to remember it. And I do expect people to remember Chinese names. I won't expect that you will be able to spell them necessarily, but you do need to be able to recognize them. And I should note the quiz and exams are open note. So if you prepare, that's not a problem. But it is important that you be able to recognize Chinese names. It would, if you had a Chinese student who studied American history and they weren't able to recognize the name Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King, we would say they didn't learn American history. Same for studying Chinese history. Now, one thing I want to point out, I talked about like making this course. This isn't the first time I've taught this course. I can't remember if this is the fourth or fifth time. I've taught this class a lot, and I learn something new each time. But I've taught it always as a straight lecture class, but I have transform it into an online hybrid. I find that seems to the results seem to be better, and the students seem to do better and seem to enjoy the course more as an online hybrid. I've done it for my Japanese history, my Korean history class, so it makes sense to do it for Chinese history. So I'm building the videos now based on my old lectures, but because I'm kind of redoing everything, there is an opportunity for student input to shape the class. So if you have something in particular you want to learn about China, please do email me and let me know. I can't guarantee that I can get it in there, but I will do my best. So I hope that you are as excited about the class as I am. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.